Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. I hope you had some good rest after quite a rich day yesterday, but obviously you were in good shape because at 10:30 you were still looking at asking questions to our keynote speaker, so the energy was obviously still flowing. And we intend to have as much an energetic day today as we had yesterday. We are going to start our discussions today about a theme which is quite important because it has been coming again and again yesterday, which is creating the virtuous circle, ethics plus transparency equal trust. And I don't know how many times yesterday the word trust came in our discussion. And we heard, and Rodrigo in his brilliant summary yesterday emphasized also this notion of trust and emphasized that trust building takes time. But it takes more than time to build trust. And in fact, to build trust, you have to demonstrate ethical requirements in corporate behavior, in the behavior of NGOs, in the philosophy of this organization, and you need to create the transparency and also the tools or the performance indicators to measure how, in a way, efficient you are in creating this context of transparency, of accountability, of respect for ethical rules that will generate the trust that we need to function efficiently. So we are going to discuss that over the next 90 minutes. And let me introduce your interlocutors for this discussion. To my immediate left is Professor Guido Palazzo, who is the director of the Department of Strategy at the Faculty of Business and Economics of the University of Lausanne. And Professor Palazzo is an expert on issues related also to trust linked to corporations, to the business world. Then I don't think I need to introduce Christopher, but for some of you who see him only as the founder of the Zermatt Summit, you should know also that in the second 100% of his life, he is also the CEO and president of TeroLab Surface Group, and he will also speak about how he implements some of these rules in his life, in his activities as a business leader. Then we have Alexander Fink, who is the CEO of Edelman, Switzerland. As you know, Edelman is one of the major PR and communication company, or global PR and communication companies, and you will understand very, very soon why it is important to have Mr. Fink for the purpose of our discussion. And then to my extreme left is Fredrik Galtung, who you have met with him yesterday. He intervened in our discussion, and he's the chief executive of Integrity Action, which is a very, I would say, important NGO in the context of our discussion. And so let me turn to Alexander Fink first, because Edelman Group, the Edelman Group, has every year a global trust index. And reading through the results of this global trust index, the latest results, we discover some striking realities and evolution with respect to this very important issue. And I think, Alexander, it might be good to hear from you some elements of the results of this year's global index and what kind of interpretation you have about these results. So, please.
Thank you, Mr. Smadja, and thank you very much for giving the opportunity that we can, as you said, Mr. Smadja, furnish data on trust that we collect each year around the world among 30,000 people in asking them how trust is established in organizations like politics, like business leader, media, and NGO. And now, after the breakfast, I have to give you some number crunching, but don't worry, it will not be too heavy, but at least some outline about what were the results. The results in general are that there is, in trust, a crisis in leadership. We are doing this since 13 years, and some years ago, perhaps you could also see this in the media coverage, the CEO, the energetic political leader, was a person that was trusted, that was leading, and that seemed to be, especially in business life, a person that could manage everything. This was before the crisis came and before business practices and behavior came on the surface that was destroying heavily this imagination, this picture of the leaders. So when we come today now to the results, the first thing is that when we look on a trustful person that is representing the company, it's not the CEO who is the most trusted person. Many might think so, but the most trusted person is an academic expert, is a neutral expert that is talking or presenting the company outside. The second striking result here is that persons like yourself are very, very trustful. These experts, these persons like yourself, have a trust of around 60%. The CEO itself has a trust of 38% on a global level. And I have also here the German data. Germany is always very skeptical in comparison to other markets. Here the trust in the CEO is even lower and ranging around 26%. So perhaps having the perception that you send out the CEO and you can rebuild trust at a strike only by the CEO is no longer valid. Think also further that business models like Amazon or other companies that are relying on the assessment of people like yourself, of people that are saying, I had experience as a customer, as an employee with this company, and I give my personal opinion outside, is much more valid and earns much more trust in the public perception. The trust crisis of leadership is not because there is a complete distrust in authority or in leadership people. It's much more because there is a disappointment that the expectations are not fulfilled. These expectations do not mean business, sheer business factors, performance factors like profit, like turnover, like innovation, like ranking on industry rankings. It means also much more to listen to the feedback of your clients, treating your employees, put customers ahead profit, and these factors that are building trust. And in the past, especially the hygienic operational factors contributed by far than 80% to the reputation, to the trust of a company. Today, it's only 47%, and 53% are those so-called soft factors that you have to earn the trust by, as I said, listening to the customers, adapting your business model, integrating your stakeholders to the public needs, being transparent in your business practices, showing your supply chain, transparency in either in food, in procurement, in the markets where you get your raw materials, and so on. This will continue, and also here, what is the conclusion? The conclusion is that the classic marketing of a company and its product will not work anymore. It will much more become an acceptance that needs to be earned by the different stakeholders. And look, for instance, on the food industry as an example, which is undergoing exactly this process, where the discussion starts, where NGOs are pushing this discussion, where the media is forcing and reinforcing this discussion, and politics try to change the legislations according to these demands. And you will see that a lot of companies will have extreme problems to handle this discussion, to become that transparent, and no longer to rely on that it is a good product or that you have a solid marketing campaign where you give benefits from the company or the products into the public. So again, trust means that the fulfillment of certain demands of the broad public is not given. And we have just asked, for instance, for business leaders, what to expect from them, being societal or ethical behavior, solving problems, addressing problems to the public. And these expectations in general are only fulfilled by around 20%. So there is a huge gap, in politics even less, a huge gap what is demanded from the public and what is delivered. And the leaders will have to address this much more in order to regain their trust. The distrust source also, of course, lies a lot within the companies itself. For a main cause for the distrust in leaders is that wrong incentives or a remuneration system that is influencing business decisions is seen as the highest source of distrust. So any sort where companies do make decisions based on wrong incentives or wrong goals in order to fulfill their personal agenda is the biggest source. Then it's corruption, then it's fraud, and then it's incompetence. These ranging lower than at around 20% and less. So also this means that the companies can, or the business leaders, the business itself can solve these problems by themselves. And even more striking, this is in the finance industry. Guess why? The finance industry, the banking industry has done a lot to get the worst #1 place in trust. It has around the trust of 20–25% only in the broad public. In comparison, technology has around 70% trust, automotive around 60% trust. The companies working in these industries, banking and financial services around 20–25%. What was the main source? The main source, 60% of the broad public says it lays within these companies. It was their behavior, their management style, their compensation policy, and all you were aware of the Minder initiative here in Switzerland, the termination of salaries, where you saw that there is a big gap between public perception and between the perception of a number of acting companies, and the outcome was exactly this, leading to a much broader discussion on the whole EU level. So again, 60% of the companies in the financial, of the people think that in the financial industries, the companies themselves are responsible for the distrust they got. So what does this mean in a final conclusion? That companies much more have to check what is the demand of the public, what is the demand of their stakeholders, to analyze how well they do perform in this, and how big is the gap. And the gap, for instance, in how do you treat your employees, how do you listen to the customer feedback, how transparent you are, especially in times of crisis and in problems. These gaps, in average, are around 40% between delivery and expectations. And so companies have really to work on that in the next years, because it will be a question. Earning trust is a key to get acceptance for the company, get acceptance for the management, get acceptance for all the stakeholders you are involved in. You know, many products are similar, and the difference then really becomes more and more for companies a distinguishing factor how trustful they are perceived in the public.
Thank you, Alexander. Guido, Palazzo, what we heard now, of course, is a reality that you know, that you experience, as an academic, as a man who is, of course, teaching business, to what extent do you think there is, first of all, an awareness in the business community about this kind of trust deficit that has been highlighted very strikingly? And to what extent do you see companies reacting and adjusting to that? Because as Alexander mentioned, in fact, the results of this survey shows that the people realize and say and state that the problem is inside the company and that it is inside the company that the problem has to be addressed. So, Guido.
If I take a bit a longer time horizon to think about trust, if you were a manager in the Middle Ages, let's say a Fugger or Medici merchant, you had bought a ticket to hell automatically because you were the lowest of the lowest with regards to reputation in your society. You go to hell, you're a manager. We are not that far away from that today in public perception. And the financial crisis might have accelerated this, but it is much older. This tendency to losing trust is much older. And it has to do with globalization, in my view, with the perception of people that through the globalization of business activities, corporations broke the social contract. If you just take your mobile phone and you ask yourself, how is it produced? It starts in Africa. There's coltan in it. Coltan comes from the Congo and it is digged by slave children. Then it goes to China, where it is assembled by young girls who kill themselves out of desperation. And in the end, if you don't need it anymore, it will be recycled by the Italian mafia somewhere in China, in Africa, or directly in Napoli. So, and this is a typical product. Every product today that comes from a global supply chain tells a story of suffering, tells a story of harm doing. And corporations have been under pressure since the early 90s. Is this my mobile phone? Yes. They have been under pressure since the early 90s to take care of these side effects. And NGOs have attacked corporations. That's how this dynamic between NGOs and corporations emerged in the early 90s. And the reaction of some companies was to decide to self-regulate. So since the 90s, we have an industry that developed that is about self-regulation. So this is the first answer corporations gave to this kind of a lack of trust in these problems. So they audit their factories, or they have their factories audited. They participate in soft law standard processes like fair labor and so on. Nothing shows the failure of this kind of answer more clearly than the factory collapse in Bangladesh in April. A factory that was certified by 2 independent organizations 1 week before it collapsed. Why doesn't it work, this kind of self-regulatory scheme? It doesn't work because companies put it next to their business as usual. And the business as usual in global supply chains is pressuring for lower prices and higher speed. If you pressure for lower prices and higher speed, you cannot be compliant with human rights. That's very obvious. It doesn't work. So this first answer is a failure, and we more and more understand that this is a failure. It is a heartless, compliance-driven way of dealing with the problems. Then we found, or someone found a second answer, Michael Porter. The answer was there. He does as if he found it, but that's another story. Win-win, creating shared value. And I'm amazed to listen to many of you yesterday how this win-win already entered our minds, how he captured our minds with this win-and-win bullshit. Sorry to say that. I think the win-win argument is the greatest harm that could have been done ever to our debate. Why? First, win-win is a fiction. There's not one serious scientific study showing a causal relation between economic and social activities. So more profit and more human rights are not connected. You can easily see this from the fact that if it would be connected, all corporations would do it. Very few do it because it is not connected. You can be a very bad actor. You can be Monsanto, Philip Morris, Walmart, ExxonMobil, all these companies that have become the poster child of what is wrong with capitalism, and you can be profitable since decades. You can be very ethical and go bankrupt. That's the first problem here. The second problem If you approach social issues with a spirit of profit, you destroy the social spirit of it. Nothing shows this more clearly than the debate on microfinance. Microfinance is a complete failure. Various studies in recent years have shown that. Colleagues from MIT, colleagues from Oxford have done studies on microfield studies, and they show that microfinance destroys more, it creates more harm than it does good. Why? Because it has been captured by the financial industry as another profit maximization instrument. The idea that it had at the beginning is completely destroyed. No company has ever been able to show me how they create shared value. It doesn't work. Shared value is a fiction. And the third argument against it, the problems we're discussing here are wicked problems. That's how political scientists call it. Wicked problems are problems that are unsolvable. Global poverty, our emissions, slave labor. All these problems are in principle unsolvable, but we still have to find solutions. That's the paradox. We have to work on it. We do not even agree on what the problem is. We do not agree on what the solutions might be, but we still have to collaborate and find solutions. That's the paradox. And these problems are so complex that it is ridiculous to frame them as win-win problems. For a company, a win-lose situation is much better from a purely economic point of view. If you have slaves, you save money. If you have less slaves, you have to pay workers. That costs money. And even the argument you threaten your reputation is not working. There's not one single case that has been shown scientifically in which a company had long-term reputational and financial problems because of human rights violations. That doesn't exist. As consumers, we don't care, and if we care until the next scandal, and then our attention deviates. So these two solutions to the destruction of trust do not work. And that's the third one, and that's why Christopher created this summit, and this is the transformation of minds and hearts. Win-win is mindless and heartless. Transforming minds and hearts means that if I'm connected to this kind of harm as a corporation, I ask myself, who is affected by what I'm doing? What kind of suffering do I co-create? What are my values? How do my values connect to the suffering I create? And what can I do about it? If I ask myself, okay, I have slaves, so let's assume I would start a project to elaborate solutions against slavery. What's in for me? What's my added value in having no slaves? If we ask these kind of questions, we are in the wrong game. That's not the business ethics game, that's the old game. We talked a lot about thinking out of the box yesterday. This is thinking into the box. Win-win is framing the problems we have against the solutions or the ideologies we had in the past, which was profit maximization. It's just another way of maximizing profits now, by using these kind of problems, by transforming them into more profit. So I believe that the solution lies in the transformations of individuals asking themselves these kind of questions, and corporations preparing the space for the managers to dare asking those questions. One of my MBA students this semester impressed me by writing an essay on a dilemma she had and the rule she found for herself to deal with these kind of situations. She wrote, my rule is, I ask myself, what would I have decided if I had no fear? Thank you.
Guido, I think you have really provoked us in terms of, as you said, thinking outside the box. But I think one point that is really important in what you said is that, in a way, globalization is generating opacity. It is opacity with respect to the sourcing of products, as you mentioned, but it is also opacity with respect to the decision-making process. Nobody knows today, if you are in a company, where the decision affecting your life has been originated, in what board somewhere the decision has been taken to close a factory or to decide on another, let's say, economic paradigm. But I think we will come to that because the only answer to these opacities that globalization is generating is, in fact, creating the conditions for greater transparency. And as you said, it comes from a change in mindset, it comes from a change of philosophy. And I think at this stage it will be important to get to an entrepreneur who has gone through this change of philosophy, this change of mindset. And so I think, Christopher, it will be, I think, very useful to hear from you the kind of mindset, the kind of philosophy with which you approach your daily decisions and your modus operandi as an executive, as a business leader, having to run a company, having to ensure that this company is profitable, but at the same time abiding by very strict ethical rules. And maybe to see that, in a way, you can square the circle in doing that. So, Christopher.
Thank you, Claude. Well, after Guido and Alexander, it's not easy to try to bring some, to shed some light on some practical solutions. I would like to maybe answer the questions in two parts. The first one is to remind you that we have done some research thanks to our academic friends, Philippe de Wood and Henri Claude, trying to summarize, it's on the website of the Zermatt Summit. It's called the Zermatt Summit Manifesto, and it's really designed to business, it's really aimed at business leaders. And basically, in this document, which I cannot summarize because we don't have enough time, but I really recommend you read it. First part is giving back the economic activity, its ethical and political dimension. In other words, it's really redefining the raison d'être of a firm. Either you have a narrow definition or you have a wider definition. And that, of course, has a direct influence on the second part of this document, which is the question of leadership. And so we talk about a new leadership, and I think we will go back to some of the things which were discussed yesterday by Rodrigo and by other eminent members and friends. We have to be very humble. And as a leader, the question of compliance is not enough. I think Fredrik will talk about that. We really, we are looking at our behavior. You know, I think in a company, whether it's the board members or whether it's the CEO, we have a great responsibility. And if we can think and do what we say, rather than think something, do something, and say something different, which is what's happening today in many companies, in many areas, not only in the corporate world, in political world, in the and this is why this question of trust is absolutely essential. So this is one part of the answer. One key thing here is the personal transformation required, like Guido said. And of course, I'm a Christian, so I pray quite often when I have to take decisions, so I could meditate. I think to be a unified person, it starts from there, because obviously you're confronted to very difficult decisions, to changing conditions every day, to pressures from your customers, from your employees, from your suppliers. And I guess the most important and the most difficult struggle is to be yourself and to remain centered. And so this is, of course, an exercise which requires daily practice. But if I go back to my own company, which is it's an engineering company with 200 people located in Europe, but we are working with global customers in the field of biomedical and in the field of material science. So we are in the engineering, surface engineering. What we do is we coat different components in biomedical, in aircraft industry, in different industries. And what we've tried to do is work with an NGO called Great Place to Work, which was founded by a journalist 30 years ago. And Great Place to Work is quite interesting because we have asked them to survey all our plants. We had 4 plants. And to, from the employee's point of view, understand how they perceive trust. Trust means credibility of the management. Let me make sure that I tell you the right thing here, so I need to go back to exactly what credibility, respect, fairness, camaraderie, which is really how people work as a team, and pride. And they have developed a way to measure this from the employee's point of view. So they have actually looked at me, they have looked at our management, and from that survey, what interesting, one of our plants came up very, very, very good scores, and the others did not. And so based on that, we took all the management together, and we decided to tailor-make a training program, which has to do with communication skills, which has to do with reviewing our strategy, because the goal of this is to empower all our employees. Because we feel that because times are tough, and probably will get tougher in the next few years, as Guido explained and Professor Munazinga said yesterday, I mean, we're not out of this crisis yet. It's probably going to get much worse before it gets better. So there's going to be a lot of suffering, there's going to be a lot of challenges, but also opportunities. And those companies that have a chance to survive and grow, I think, are those that have been able to have everybody thinking as if the company was their company, and where they feel their talents are valued, where they think their ideas have been, where there is a system where we can collect ideas and make everybody think and participate in the company. Now that is a challenge. We embarked on that road, and very humbly, we're really not there yet. We started. It's a several-year program. But I think this is quite interesting that, yes, there's no one answer, of course, but there are some paths I think we can go down. When you look, I think many people yesterday said, you know, we have now these new systems such as open source, open crowd, R&D. I think somebody mentioned, I think it was from KPMG, that they've asked their employees to solve problems that have nothing to do with their immediate responsibility. I think there's a tremendous talent in companies, in organizations, in the business world, but also in general, which is untapped, where people are basically looking at their watches and waiting to go back home to finally do what they want to do, what they like to do. And so as a leader, our goal is really to try to, to bring the talents to serve the company. And of course, if you as a leader don't serve the company yourself because you're more, you're more busy with your ego or your bonus system or whatever, then it gets very difficult to get that message across. And then the question of trust plays an important role.
One follow-up question, Christopher. Does it make it easier for you to follow that kind of path that you have described because you don't have shareholders?
We have 10% of our employees will be shareholders starting in the next 2 months, but I'm the major shareholder, so that gives you, of course, more flexibility than if I was a listed company. And I think this question of trust and innovation will come from SMEs. With all respect for the large groups that are here today, I think because we have this flexibility, I think we can show some innovation in this. And you look at most of the economies in Europe, most of the economy is SMEs, it's small and medium-sized enterprises, family-owned. And normally family-owned businesses have a more long-term view than they want to pass on the business to the next generation. So they're concerned with profit, of course. They have to be sustainable, but they're also concerned with values and with a certain line of conduct. But what I also did, I think is important, is to align the management from my company to long-term objectives. So of course, if you have a bonus system where you are only basically judging your managers on short-term results, maximizing profits, and then you're telling them, please, let's focus on things, for the midterm, there's a contradiction in that. So what we've tried to do is align our bonus systems on short-term results, on economic results, for 50% of the amount, and the other part is based on qualitative, let's say, how do you say this, criteria, which have to do with with some of the things we're measuring in our company.
Thank you.
May I step in here for the trust results that we have also seen that in SMEs, the trust is in our Western Hemisphere much, much higher, and the perception is exactly as you described. And in comparison, in emerging markets, the trust in global big companies to solve problems there in the country is much higher. So, and the second point to add is when you see that the period of management in a leading position has shortened dramatically within the last years. So they have been 10, 15 years, now they are only 2, 3 years, which has a tremendous effect on the bonus systems because these people start to think really short term, only to maximize their personal agenda because 2 years later, the max, it might be over.
Exactly. That's also a point that we discussed yesterday. Now, let me turn to you, Fredrik, because your NGO is dealing with these kind of issues about trust, about ethics, about transparency. And of course, one key question is how do you measure, in a way, the performance indicators? What are the performance indicators? How do you measure that? Because we have seen, and Guido mentioned that, but also it was quite clear from our discussion yesterday that just compliance will not do, because you can be a fully compliant company with respect to laws, regulation, the stock market rules, etc., and you can be a company which doesn't enjoy any trust and which has a very low level of ethics when you take that in a broader sense of the term. So first of all, maybe it will be good that you describe in a few sentences what your NGO does, and then to get into this notion of performance indicators. Because of course you can say that, okay, we will wait the results of the next global index coming up next year, but I think there are some performance indicators that we can observe. So please.
Thank you very much, Claude. And thank you very much, Claude and Christopher, for inviting me and for enabling me to be here today. Actually, before I do that, I want to build on a couple of the points that were made earlier to share a recent anecdote. So John Zogby, the American pollster, has, through his work, suggested that the age group between 18 and 29 in the US, he calls them the first globals. The 60s generation identified with people around the world, but for the first time in American history, there's a generation of young people with en masse identifying with concerns internationally. It's never been the case before. And the anecdote I want to share with you is I had a couple of meetings with someone called Stephen Rice. He's the Executive Vice President for Human Resources at Juniper Networks. Apparently about 90% of the internet goes through some of their hardware at some point. So they're in Silicon Valley. He's in charge of recruiting people. They have 9,000 employees. And they're in the war for talent that we've been talking about. Their offices are located right next to Facebook on the one hand and Apple on the other. And these are the people they're competing with. The second question that candidates ask them in job interviews is, what's your social purpose? What are the NGOs you support? That's the second question candidates ask. And they started being asked that question only very recently. And so it woke him up. And they started a partnership 4 or 5 years ago with a very interesting NGO that I won't go into the details of. It's called Not For Sale. It deals with human trafficking. So they picked a small NGO doing cutting-edge, very interesting things, and they donate a high six-figure sum to this NGO every year, but they also integrate their work with their staff. So actually all staff can feel involved in various ways. Very, very creative. But the interesting secondary finding from this that Stephen shared is an HR company that they work with assessed employees and applicants and found out that if employees really identify with the social purpose of the company, they can pay 15% less to the candidates. So actually the high six-figure sum that they're paying the NGO, across 9,000 employees, they more than make up for it. So is it a cynical win-win? In a certain sense it is, but the staff identify with it and they make a very nice, tidy saving on it. I just thought I would share that. So what I've been in the business, in a certain sense, of working in the anti-corruption field for 20 years. I was the first staff member of Transparency International, and I was its head of research. And I'm sure you're all familiar with the Corruption Perceptions Index. I oversaw that, but I developed the Bribe Pairs Index, the Global Corruption Barometer, various other surveys. So I've been in this business of monitoring, measuring governance in various ways for a long time. And now 10 years ago, we started a new NGO, a few of us, because we felt we'd done a lot on awareness raising and advocacy, but we needed to do something more in implementation as an NGO and really empower citizens to make change that was meaningful to them. Because a lot of legal changes were happening, new institutions were being introduced, but people weren't feeling the benefits. And you know, in recent years, every few months, you see major demonstrations triggered by anger about corruption. The latest ones are in Brazil. Right? Mass frustration about misallocation of resources, overspending on football stadiums, and money not going into social issues. And Mr. Blatter saying, don't blame football. It's your choices. We have nothing to do with it. And of course, in Istanbul, same thing, right? Upsetness about a square. But the reason people are upset is that the oligarchs in Turkey were going to be the ones benefiting from the urban renewal and development, and no middle income, let alone low income housing being considered as part of it. So what we started 10 years ago, when we started our work, we naively thought it would take us 3-4 years, and actually we're at the low end of the curve. It was very interesting to see the social entrepreneurship curve, because it took us 10 years, basically, to get to the results that I want to share with you. So what are those results? So in effect, if you look at all the inputs that promote transparency, promote accountability, that seek to reduce corruption, you can on the one hand try to link them to macro indicators like the Corruption Perceptions Index or the Edelman Trust Survey. But it's very difficult to make a connection between those inputs and those macro indicators. What we were even more interested in was seeing, could we make a connection between those inputs and micro-level indicators of impact on the ground. But there was nothing to connect the two. And what we were looking for was, how could we assess that impact, that connection? And so what we have proposed as an impact measure is something we call the fix rate. So what's the fix rate? I mean, to define that, we have to define what a fix is first. A fix is the resolution of a problem to the satisfaction of the main stakeholders. And the key is, did they use transparency, accountability, integrity tools, processes, laws, norms, in order to resolve that problem? And if they did, that's one fix. And the rate at which they try to do it then becomes the fixed rate. So let me be concrete about it. So in India, there's a Right to Information Act that was passed nationally in 2005. And it's quite groundbreaking because it came out of social movements for social justice, not out of civil and political issues. If I submit a Right to Information application as an Indian, and I submit it to a public employee, if he doesn't respond within 21 days, 300 rupees is taken off his salary every day that he doesn't respond. Kenya had passed a new constitution following a national referendum. Part of the new constitution is the Freedom of Information law. If I submit a Right to Information application, there, a Freedom of Information application, and you don't respond within a month, I can sue you. Right? So two different triggers, right? Similar time frame and two different triggers. On paper, they look roughly similar. But if you look at the fixed rate that these two laws would generate from the perspective of a poor person, the fixed rate is going to be diametrically different. Right? The Indian one is going to produce a very high fixed rate. Whereas the Kenyan one, how many poor people can sue? They can't. So if you're Coca-Cola and you have a law firm in Delhi and a law firm in Nairobi sending letters, clearly it's going to get an answer. But if you're a poor person, because the person will know it's a poor person, because the issues they're writing about is a poor person's concern, the fixed rate is going to be diametrically different. Now, we were trying to apply this principle to resolve complex problems, actually. And so, yeah, wicked problems. Corruption has been around for a very, very long time. And we certainly haven't found a magic wand to it. But we have found something that produces a fixed rate of on average, more than 50%, sometimes 80%, i.e. of the problems that local communities identify, they're able to solve well more than half of them. So what kinds of problems am I talking about? So It can be the very crude. A road was contracted for 8 meters width. It was actually built 5 meters wide. It was contracted for 5 centimeters thickness. It was actually built 1 to 2 centimeters thick. The fix is, again, without spending any money on asphalt, no money on gravel, is to get it back to 8 meters and 5 centimeters thickness. And you can imagine how much money was stolen, but that's what we've been able to do in a number of places. So in Afghanistan, the biggest constructor of schools was UNICEF. They built hundreds of schools because the Afghan government wasn't entrusted with the money. Their controls were extremely weak. So we found that 31% of the schools that were built were catastrophic. They were virtually unusable, they were dangerous. We asked UNICEF for the contracts because having access to the contracts makes the monitoring, is part of what makes the monitoring possible. UNICEF refused to provide the contracts. They fought it every step of the way, fearing a big scandal. But that's not our approach. Our approach is to try to fix the problem. And so we fixed 70% of the schools without any participation from UNICEF. So the three key ingredients to how we make this happen are two a little bit counterintuitive elements in a sense. So the first is to work with local institutions. It's collaborative, including with corrupt institutions, because you don't pick your counterparts. And so it has to be collaborative. Confrontational approaches can produce short-term wins, but never long-term wins. The second element in it is very strong evidence. Now, we gather evidence which amounts to actually evidence of corruption, like the road case I told you about, like the 31% of schools. So we have plenty of evidence of corruption. But the counterintuitive part of it is we don't use it to make a scandal. We don't use it to take people to court. But it creates incredible leverage. And then the total orientation on the fix, on the solution. In getting access to water, in getting schools fixed, repaired. So we've improved garbage collection in Kyrgyzstan, improved rate collection tenfold, etc., etc. The two paradigm changes that this involves is, on the one hand, is the highlighting of problems. So the problem with the compliance-based paradigm is that there's no incentive for anyone to bring up a problem. If you don't have anyone bringing up problems, how can you fix them? How can you resolve them? So in the compliance-based paradigm, and that applies in various sectors, right? So in a manufacturing process, if you're a leading manufacturer, you clearly want your supply chain and workers to identify problems before the customer does. By the time it gets to the customer, it's a bit late, right? But in the compliance-based system on governance and anti-corruption, there's no incentive for anyone to say, yep, we discovered 20% leakage here. So the method we've developed has an incentive because it's based on people's needs. The second paradigm change with this is that, of course, it's better if the principal is on board, if the mayor is on board, if UNICEF is on board. But we can show that we can achieve high fixed rates even if they're not on board. So participatory development, like if you do participatory budgeting, if I'm an enlightened mayor, we'll do participatory budgeting. But if the citizens want participatory budgeting and the mayor says no way, it's not going to happen. If people want the World Bank to consult them, the World Bank can say no. But here we're able to make this happen even if that counterparty says no. It'll be even better, of course, if they're on board. So those are two important paradigm changes with this. So what we want to introduce with the fixed rate, of course, with our methodology, we claim that we actually achieve a reasonably high fixed rate and that we can use this. We've used this now. We have strong data from 6 countries. We've applied it in more than 10, and now we're scaling up. We got an award from Google just a couple of weeks ago, which gives you a sense of the proportions. We're getting £500,000 from Google, which are going to impact on 500,000 people in 18 months. That's a very quick turnaround and a very efficient use of funds through this. So integrity actually doesn't cost a huge amount to achieve, right? Corruption is, of course, incredibly wasteful. We estimate that at least 25% of aid is lost to corruption. And yet an investment of 1%, 2% in integrity could be reducing that loss rate quite dramatically. But the principle of the fixed rate applies beyond that, applies beyond the work that we do. And if others can show that their approach generates a better fixed rate, all the more power to them. And if they generate it more cost effectively, that'll be wonderful. So that'll be a race going up rather than down. Thank you.
Thank you, Fredrik. I think we have got some real, I know it is used too much, but I would use it here, real food for thought during this first 50 minutes of our discussion. Let me now open the floor to discussion and question, because it can be question, but it can be also some remarks or feedback. Gustavo.
Yeah, thank you. On the issue of trust, I'd just like to have the opinion of the panel on the following. I have the impression that trust is more a problem in companies where the CEO does not own the company, i.e. he's just a glorified employee looking for another job. Sorry to be so crude, but that's a reality. And in companies where it's owned by families, there's long-term view, there is more trust than in other companies. That's my impression. I have no numbers to prove it, but I'd like to have your opinion on that. The second one, Guido, sorry to disagree with you on a couple of points. I don't want the audience here to go away and thinking that microfinance doesn't work. Mohammed Yunus will prove you wrong. But also, the Red Cross and many other institutions that are doing microfinancing their work. And on the win-win situation, there are many examples that that is a true situation, for instance, housing for low-income people in Central America, etc. I'd like to have your opinion.
Yes, I would not claim that it is impossible to create win-win. I just claim that it is not an automatic connection between the two. And the risk is that if you look for win-win, you try to get the low-hanging fruits, because the real problems are too complex. There was one interesting thing that someone said in the first panel yesterday morning. When it comes to the real issues like human rights, the cooperation between companies and NGOs gets more problematic, because that's when they really have to change their behavior, their structures, their operations. And then when they withdraw from the collaboration, they prefer the low-hanging fruits. And if you think in win-win logics, you look for low-hanging fruits. If you want to abolish slave labor at Ivory Coast, it will take you 20 years. How do you frame this in a win-win logic? I was criticizing not Mohamed Yunus, I was criticizing the fact that the banking system has captured the idea. And that's the problem. And if you look at the interest rates that poor people pay and the methods applied to make social pressure on them to pay back, you see a lot of devastation of social connections, where people get under pressure from their neighbors, where you destroy the social community by creating that kind of pressure. And there are studies showing that people, in a lot of situations, just use this money to survive, not for entrepreneurship reasons. So I don't want to destroy the idea as such, but I'm always cautious if something is presented as the magic bullet, and it's not the magic bullet. It has already been mainstreamed too much. For the trust, perhaps one sentence, I would agree with this tendency, but we should not underestimate the impact of the social context. Societies have levels of trust that are higher or lower. So whether you are big or a small company might have an impact, but it's also important, where is that company? Is it in South Italy or is it in Milano, for instance? That has an impact as well.
Perhaps also to add to your question, in general, yes, if you have a shareholder structure that is stable, that is long-term oriented, this is key. And this long-term orientation is immediately translated into how do you retain employees, how do you react when the profit is lower than expected, and how do you react especially in crisis situations. And then you can very well have the real blueprint of against all the marketing messages that are put ahead in other times. But you should also think that it's a question of transparency. You have sometimes family-owned companies that are very intransparent. So I wouldn't completely agree to that, because here it is also to tell how you make business decisions, how the transparency is about who the management is chosen. Is it based on qualified, that you're a qualified person, or is it more because you're a sheer member of the family? So there are also some problems that you get trust in management capabilities, for instance. A real issue is the shareholder itself, and we very carefully look about what's the intention of the shareholders. Unfortunately, the tendency is clearly a quarterly driven shareholder point of view to squeeze out companies that you get the balance sheet each quarter right, and not on a long-term assessment. And think about only the Swiss watch industry, for instance, that if they would have only reacted on a quarterly basis, I think the huge renaissance of it would never have happened. Luckily, some companies had a very long breath and came back to quality, to the virtues of the companies, and this is a very good example that you should have a long breath. I strongly hope that Europe differs in that sense from the Anglo-Saxon mentality of a very quarterly focused business model.
But if I can, yes. On the microfinance, I'm afraid I'm also a critic, and sorry to say that, but there are two critical questions to ask yourself. It's not the repayment rate, and it's not the sustainability or profitability of the microfinance institutions that should be the key criteria. There are two questions. One is, what is the graduation rate of micro businesses to SMEs? And that graduation rate is miserably poor. It's very, very low. So, of course, there are case studies of marvelous women who created a business that employs people, but overall, that graduation rate is very, very poor. And the second problem is actually that a micro business in a village, a small town, unless it's exporting, selling something to another village, what you find is that very often, and the rate is unfortunately on average 60 to 70%, is that that micro business makes another business collapse. Because if they're selling within the village, there probably was someone else selling chicken already. And so the rate at which they are destroying other businesses is very high. So when you look at those two factors, actually micro businesses have not been terribly successful, and there are two explanations for that. One is governance in these settings is very weak. So they're not able to graduate into SMEs because of the institutional factors. And the second one is trust. For SMEs to form, as exactly the Edelman data shows from emerging countries, since trust between SMEs is so low, they're not able to do business with each other. So micro businesses can do business with the customer, but SMEs to thrive have to create trust. And that's where there's a step change actually needed.
Thank you. Let me go here, and then I come to you.
Yeah, I just want to make a point about the issue of globalization creating opacity and all the evil that comes from it. You know, coming myself from a developing country and having worked in developing countries and development projects for many years, I can see that there is a good side also in terms of introducing standards that weren't there before, because the child labor and slave work has existed already, and I think the companies like the ones who are here have a huge role in demanding better standards and introducing standards where there weren't none, or lower ones. So I don't see it all as an evil. Of course, globalization, what it does, it introduces a higher demand in natural resources, and then you magnify a problem that was there already. But I think there is a real role for a real positive impact of globalization in introducing better standards.
Just on that, I don't think, and I think this has been one of the big mistakes at the end of the 90s, I don't think that it is useful, realistic, beneficial to think of globalization in moralistic terms, whether it is evil or it is the eighth wonder of the world. I think globalization is a fact. It is happening. It continues to expand. So this is a reality that we need to live with. The issues that we are facing is, and we can talk about the benefits of globalization, but the issues we are facing, and this is one of the elements which is behind our agenda here, is the dislocating impact of globalization. When you think about it, and let me just take 2 minutes because this is part of our agenda in this session. When you think about it, it has taken in the Western world 150 years to achieve accountability and transparency. Let's say in the 70s, you knew that the guy making the decision about your salary was 2 floors above, and it was Guido. You knew that your elected member in parliament was making the decision that will impact your mortgage rate, that condition your life. Globalization has created a situation where you don't even know the name and the face of the guy in the board sitting somewhere in Bermuda that has decided that this factory should be closed. Globalization has made it that today the decision affecting your life, let's say your mortgage, are not taken by a man you can put a face or a woman you can put a face. It is done according to some technocrats, let's say in Brussels or in Frankfurt. And so this is one of the issues that we are facing today, that it has created this opacity. You don't know where and how and who makes the decisions that affect directly your life. This is a fact of globalization. So the question is not whether it is good or bad, it could be reversed. The question, I think, is how do we deal with that? How do we address the challenges and the questions and the dilemmas that this creates for us, whether as the man in the street or as somebody who can have even a minimal impact on the way things can be modified, improved, whatever. And so I think this is something that we need to think about. In the same way, just think about it. The major criteria of the degree of civilization of a society used to be the degree of security and predictability that this society provided to its citizens. This was one of the major criteria of the degree of civilization of a society. Look at it today. Predictability, nobody can guarantee you anything. Security, many people are asking themselves whether they will have a job in 6 months. And again, this is part of this new context. And again, the question, we can spend until the rest of our life saying, oh, it is good or it is bad. This is not the issue. How do we deal with it? And I think this is the kind of perspective that we should have in our discussion. Mr. Palazzo.
Thank you. This is a very interesting discussion. I'd like to share a couple of things, and then I have a question. The first is that, Guido, you referred to, the merchants of 500 years ago being destined to hell. I mean, the history of economic development also showed there were a lot of good merchants. Industrialization, if you take even companies like Unilever.
That was not my point. I was not saying.
Well, but hold on, it's good. There was something there about a certain framework, a certain approach, and I think that people have studied capitalism for hundreds of years, and there's also another side. There is also good capitalism, and there are many examples of also family businesses, of dynasties, and groups like Unilever and others that actually started with a very strong social purpose. And in the family business world, there's many examples of that. So I think it depends on where we look. But the real question for me is, see, the question isn't so much about it's possible to be successful in business and be unethical. The question is, if you are ethical, how can you still be successful? And I think this is actually what Christopher Wasserman said. This is my experience. 15, 20 years ago, I started a network in Europe with Ben Cohen of Ben & Jerry, Anita Roddick of The Body Shop, and I actually witnessed and saw how they were thinking. And it's really what Christopher was saying. It's a daily practice. Every decision you take, you actually assess that decision against your ethics and your values. And then what you try to do is you maximize the number of decisions that are consistent with your values. And that works. There are many examples. I'm at the moment working with the B Corporation in Europe. These are companies that sort of stand for certain values. And the question is, how do you actually succeed in business and retain your values and your ethics? So that's for me a real key point in the discussion.
Could you explain what B Corporation is for the people here? Maybe they don't know.
B Corporation started about 6 years ago. It's a rating system for companies that stand for certain social, environmental, governance goals. And in Latin America, we have a number of friends here from Sistema B, which is actually the version of B Corporation in Latin America. There are about 800 companies now in the world that have actually been rated according to these values, these criteria, and over 8,000 companies that have done the assessment to see how they would rank according to these criteria. So there's a growing movement now. I will say something later on today about actually those entrepreneurs that want to stay with their values. How can they distinguish themselves within the wider economy as companies that stand for what they, their values and their ethics? So the question is, for us, I think also as a movement, how can you actually learn continuously to actually be successful while staying with our values? And this brings me to my question to Fredrik. I think it was very, very exciting what you shared. The question is, in all the kind of cases and examples that you have, that you do daily, projects like you mentioned with Google and in Afghanistan with the schools, does it always work? Or in other words, where does it not work? Because if it always worked, then obviously there is a real solution there that could be applied much more widely. So where does it not work?
Well, I mean, when I say that we have a fixed rate of 50%, actually on average it's more than 60, that means 40% failure, right? So of the problems people identify, they're not able to solve a number of them. And why does it not work? So I said that most institutions are not willing to share contracts, for example, or performance information. And we're working both services and infrastructure. Infrastructure clearly is more tangible, but it's very good if we have contracts. So even when UNICEF wasn't providing the contracts, through all kinds of means, we found contracts in 50% of the cases. Where we had the contracts, it's much easier to have leverage on the constructors. But then you have spoilers. You have people who are very astute at undermining, all kinds of efforts. And so we had some initiatives that looked very promising. And actually one which was a public-private NGO partnership, which we really hoped was going to be one of our flagships, and the spoilers undermined it every step of the way. But so, yeah, those are the factors, and we learn from that process, right? So we try to learn each time. We try to feedback also. But the key here is flipping the problem on its head and actually rewarding people for resolving problems rather than simply trying to track and assess what is the scale of the problem on the whole, which has not been a productive way of resolving issues.
Next question.
Yes, please. I would like to share some points. I'm very happy that we got tonight, this morning, a little bit another view about the business understanding. Yesterday, I've got the feeling that we have something like generalization about business. Sorry, is devil. Business is bad, and I would like to emphasize what we've heard from Christopher, what we've heard already about small and medium enterprises in Europe. I agree. I'm not comfortable enough about developing countries. About the experience there of SME. My question or my share is we should be careful not to generalize, and we have some examples here. And the other is about trust. How are we able to increase trust? And we have had yesterday to increase cooperation between businesses and NGOs or civil society. And I think there is especially one point we should add for the SME in Switzerland, for example, small and medium enterprises. There is more than 50% of businesses over there. And we should just take actions to work on those. I haven't said it before. I'm a strategic management consultant for especially SME business. So I'm not working for a lot of international, big international companies, but especially SME. And there is a huge potential. And there is one potential, which is awareness. They are not aware about what we are discussing here. They are not aware that we have a lack of trust, that they have a lack of trust. I have also NGOs or non-profit organization I'm able to support. The CEO is just not conscious that there is no trust. And there is not only no trust outside, but there is no trust inside the company as well. And the second thing is, how are we able, they need to know how to do. And it was Alexander who said, they don't know how to do leadership competencies. And I think also here we should be aware of a very, very old leadership idea of McGregor. He said X and Y. Probably you know it. And we have to be careful not to become an X philosophist. That means that we always see with the other the ego side and the evil side from the others and believe that we are good. But we have to, trust means we have to give trust also to people that they can change. And here, in this room yesterday, I've got the feeling we are good friends. And outside, they will not change. They are not really willing to change. There is an Obama which is not willing to change. There is a Merkel. We need to do a lot of things. Only we can do it. Sorry to be a little bit critical, but that was a summary of my yesterday's feeling, and I thought it's the trust, it's about this topic right now. Thank you.
Any reaction to that?
If I may, just 2 words, but I would like to not take away the time from my colleagues. On the trust issue, we talked about trust in the company. There is corporate social responsibility, just 2 words on that, is in our definition is not reinvesting the money of the company in philanthropy. That's very nice, but for us, this is not the priority. The priority of corporate social responsibility is first taking care of your own employees, what's happening in the company. And so what we have tried to do is really use corporate social responsibility as in the heart of our strategy, in our activities, in everyday life. And this also, we talked about trust within the company, but like Fredrik said, we need to also work on trust with the different stakeholders. And corporate social responsibility is really working with your suppliers and developing a trust relationship outside the company, with the community where you live, because you're not living in a bubble. You're, if you want to be a good citizen, you're in a certain community, and with your customers, of course. And that generates a lot of ideas. Not only is it good, but it's also profitable. It generates relations, strong relations, and it also helps the SME become much more innovative and probably more competitive on the market. So that's the issue of trust, let's say, not only within, but also with the community.
A quick follow-up. I mean, I love the tagline of the Zermatt Summit, because actually I think more than ethics and transparency, it's putting the human at the center. That is the key to this. So what we tried to do was to find ways in which very regular people, in fact, very poor people, we have a woman in Timor-Leste who only did 4th grade, who's never had formal employment, who has 2 children. She said, I never thought I could ask such questions and get answers before. And so it's finding ways of empowering very regular people to be part of the change. And that evidently includes SMEs. If I can bore you, if you picture a 2x2 table with compliance integrity, reactive versus proactive. So the classic paradigm on compliance is clearly reactive compliance. Something bad happens, you pounce and you do something about it. There's been a lot of innovation in proactive compliance. But actually, it's very difficult to show how impactful it is and what it really does. Does it really make a difference? When it comes to reactive integrity, it's in a sense providing ethical advice. Yeah? And that's important as well. On its own, however, of course, it's very weak. Now, corporations have to do both proactive and reactive compliance. All corporations, all regulators require that of multinationals as well. But the problem with that paradigm is that it does nothing for your marketplace. You control your own company and your suppliers. But it doesn't say anything about your competitors. It doesn't say anything about the government. And so in order to do that, you have to step out of simply the compliance paradigm to do something which we would call proactive compliance. And that's where the next set of innovations have to happen, because otherwise it's impossible to affect the wider marketplace. And that's where actually collaboration comes into the picture, whether it's SMEs or companies working together with external stakeholders. It's impossible to manage that on their own. And as far as developing countries are concerned, governments are concerned, the compliance paradigm has been an absolute and total failure.
Just may I add very roughly only 2 sentences on that. What me struck were 2 things. You spoke about movement, and that's very good. That should be the attitude. Because what me really worries from a PR and marketing perspective is that it's mostly perceived still as a very nice to have attitude, but nothing where on a broad scale you go out and you show how this will work, what's the impact, and how this is affecting, as you said, Christopher, all the stakeholders, all the people that are involved. And we have also to rethink that we are not only the good guys who do it right, but that we do find a way to shape the public discussion on this, that this will be the future trend. And the SMEs you mentioned, they are mostly very stubborn on that, because the huge multinationals, they have great programs. They have it overall. They are mostly in a very good shape regarding compliance, regarding programs. The SMEs, you need to convince them, and I know this, for instance, from the food industry, you need really to convince them, no, now you should talk to an NGO. They are no longer the communists, the enemies. You don't want to talk, but that's the attitude. And it's not only 1 or 2 enterprises. And we need to break up this dialogue much more.
Serena?
Thank you. Firstly, on the point of creating shared value and shareholder value, I think there's a growing body of evidence that demonstrates that companies with strong environmental, social, and governance performance is a good proxy for a well-run company. So Deutsche Bank did a study of 100 academic and other research papers, and it found that companies that have strong ESG performance have a lower cost of capital and lower long-term risk. And Ipsos Mori did a study, and it also showed higher average shareholder return and lower volatility. I just wonder if any of you disagree with that. Unilever also, when they stopped doing quarterly reporting, there was an immediate dip in their shareholder value, but it very quickly recovered. Secondly, on the point of employee engagement, it's certainly something that we also get asked a lot in the recruitment process. And I think one of the ways that companies can show that they're living their values is to offer staff an ethical pension option, and even better, to have the ethical pension option the default choice, given that very few people alter from the default. It's not something that I think is widely offered. I just wonder if you know of companies that have that as their default option. And thirdly, just on the point of compliance, in the UK, one of the responses of the regulator to the banking crisis has been to create another regulatory body that specifically focuses on financial conduct, essentially, looking at the processes by which banks and insurers put the customer at the heart of all their processes and their decision making. Do you have any confidence that that can help to restore trust in the industry? Thank you.
Guido?
I just want to react to the first point, and I strongly disagree. The studies you mentioned are not done by scientists, they're done by consulting companies. And they're building, that's the first problem. Companies who want to sell something, in particular packages of environmental or CSR consulting around that. Second, these studies build on self-descriptions of corporations. Third, none of these things controls for reverse causality. Reverse causality means maybe it is not that it pays to be green, But because you make a lot of profits, you can afford to be greener than the others. So there are millions of scientific problems. There's no scientific study that shows this link. These are just consulting studies.
Question here.
There was a question about the compliance.
Compliance.
I just only make a brief remark to the last thing. I don't know whether body will function exactly on that, but we have examined that if the broad public wants more regulation or control, in general, the approval for regulation is quite low. It's about 12–13% only of the population. But the biggest concern is that the government or the authorities must do much more, that companies behave responsively and ethically, and this is 39%. So there is a strong demand to get more control in behaving. So they are following the right demand, but I don't know whether it will work in practice.
Okay, we are going to take 3 questions, because first, then Antonin, and then I come to you. Sorry. Go ahead.
Okay, very quickly. I think on the we and you, I mean, we use these terms a lot. What are we and you? You know, ultimately, we're all consumers. You know, let's talk about our world. You know, I think what epitomizes the discussion is when you held up the smartphone. You know, and that's the point. I mean, Jonathan Porritt recently said, I think that's the tagline really. You know, we talk green, we buy brown. We are empowered. You know, it sounds like, you know, we're not empowered. I mean, in this world that we live in a country like Switzerland, in Europe, in the US, we are empowered, you know. And this whole discussion about companies and regulators and so on, it comes down to one thing, you know, is we always find excuses not to do what we're supposed to do, you know, for whatever reason. And I think that's at the core of the whole discussion. I'd like the panel to comment on that.
Guido?
Yeah, that's an important point, and I completely agree. And this links back to the idea of Christopher with his summit. It's about transformation, and the one who has to transform him or herself as well is the consumer in us. But the consumer is a fragmented landscape. You cannot change anything as a single consumer. Corporations can. So more power leads to more responsibility. What I see and what I find fascinating in recent years is that companies start to understand that they have to include consumer transformation into their CSR. So that it's not just enough to provide information on how good you are and then wait for the consumer to reward that, but to develop systems to transform the behavior of consumers in the right direction, which was not perceived as the role of corporations so far. But companies like Puma, Barilla, they start to do that now. And that's what I find fascinating.
Antonin?
Yes, thank you. Claude, I would like to talk to you for once, because when Guido mentioned that there was a need to change our hearts, you immediately commented that it was a change in mindset, which is not the same thing. That's one point. The second point I would like to make is the very concretely from the corruption. How is it done, basically? And I think there is a report by Ernst & Young saying 2000 was published very recently, actually, saying that managers feel increased pressure to deliver growth. But who is putting them under pressure? It's the number one, because the number one wants to make more money. And he says that he has to make more money because he's under the pressure of the shareholders, which is just an alibi. He wants to make more pressure for himself, as Alexander said before. Okay? He's staying for 3 years at the helm of the corporation, and he wants to make more money over that short period of time. Now, if he's putting more heart in his job, he will take a longer view, will put less pressure on his managers, and his managers will be doing less corruption. There is a systemic issue here, which starts with the number one, I think.
Question here.
It's okay, though. I just want to come back to your point, Mr. Smadja, about changing world. In fact, when we are talking about trust in enterprises, we have lived in a world for decades where the firm, the enterprises, were the closed cell protecting the human being. We have talked yesterday about thinking out of the box. How do we are doing that about this topic? After the fall of the Berlin Wall, the internet created a new age of incredible democratic creativity. Everybody can say anything, everybody can do anything through the internet, and within days or weeks have a worldwide success in terms of thinking, in terms of money making. But this is a world without legacy, and a world without trust, in fact. For example, most of the religious institutions in the world, whatever religion you take, have lost 50% of their credibility in the last 10 or 15 years, because we are living in a world where there is no reference. We don't know exactly who has the legacy to say what and to do what. So therefore, I think that to think out of the box is to understand, maybe to understand that enterprises is not anymore giving trust and cannot give trust or create trust for the human, but it is only the human individual that can create the trust inside and for the enterprises. We have to reverse completely the way of thinking the relationship between the individual and the firm.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Rob Cameron of a company called Sustainability, which is a B Corporation. I'm very proud to say. I've really enjoyed the discussion. There's so much to reflect on, but rather than going into all of it, just a couple of very quick things. I am so glad, Guido, that you've taken on the shared value notion. Business has colonized what, at its heart, originally was quite a good idea. Porter made it into something that has become a kind of received wisdom. And you're so right, because the one thing, there's a philosophical problem right at the heart of it. Who defines the value? And so often when I look at sort of, you know, where business has colonized creating shared value, the value is defined in the terms of the business, not enough in terms of the other party. And we have such a narrow definition of value. You know, I was listening to someone the other day, you know, describing it in terms of a spectrum of light, where we can see the bit in the middle, but we miss the ultraviolet, we miss so much else. You know, our definition of value in economic terms is fundamentally flawed. And so if you're going to talk about shared value, you've got to address it from the point of view of the other party's version of value. We don't do that enough. The question, though, and I could go on, but I've got my chance later on today, so I'll stop there. I have a question, and it's, where do you, the panel, find hope?
Who wants to answer? Christopher. Christopher first, please.
Well, I think there is hope because, like Hervé said, if there is not one solution, it will come from individuals. And of course, we all live on hope, and we all have faith, not maybe in God, but in science, in technology, in whatever. So, I mean, we as human beings, I think, have hope. One thing I wanted to say is we need standards. You know, I come from an engineering background, so we try to measure everything. And obviously, as we go in these issues that are called soft issues, which you don't find on the balance sheet or on the income statement, but they surely have a huge importance, we need to start measuring trust. We need to start measuring reporting on sustainability. I think one of the questions was, is there some standards in reporting on corporate social? I think the Global Responsibility Initiative is one, and there are some others which are getting more widespread. And we have to report things, and that, I think, helps on the trust and helps on the credibility and helps on transparency and on the accountability. That's my answer, but maybe there's a better one from my...
Yeah, there's hope, but it's I think we are in a process of change. It will last long. I don't fully agree to your comment that we completely talk green and then completely differently. But we've seen the signs, as I said, for instance, in the food industry, as in the procurement of and the behavior of big companies producing in Asia or so on. These are first signs. It's not enough at all. We are all clear. But the direction is still there, and it will be, you need breadth, and you need the integration of all the stakeholders. But I'm very confident that the first signs show where the direction goes. And perhaps this is a very early starting point we are currently in.
When it comes to corruption, and people don't feel empowered at all, actually, right? And so they feel politicians are not responsive to them. They put a ballot in a box every 4 or 5 years, but they keep on messing up. Or they take those 4 years to steal as much as they can and know that they will be kicked out, but then the next guys come in. And so they feel empowered enough to demonstrate, and maybe even in the extreme cases to overthrow a government. But that, of course, doesn't produce any systemic change. I heard disheartening stories from a lawyer in Tunisia, how the new government in Tunisia, apparently they didn't wait. They are stealing in horrendous ways. So that's very, very disheartening. So, in fact, what gives me hope, and of course I'm talking, from a 20-year effort of working on this. But yes, to the extent that we are able to see those changes, people getting water for the first time in 20 years in a community that had the water lines laid, but the water engineer stole the pump, so they never got water. Without buying a new pump, they now have water, right? That's very inspiring. That does give me hope.
I think we just have to compare what we are discussing right now and what we discussed 10 years ago. I remember well when I started to teach business ethics to managers, I had to spend at least 1 hour to explain to them why they should sit there and listen to me. And these times are over, and this is an amazing change that happens in all fields of life, and therefore I think we can be hopeful.
Yes.
John, can we take one last question, which is the person has been waiting there. It's a lady, very short.
I need really to make it very short. Okay. Okay. No, I think we need to come to a close because we could continue for quite some time on this discussion. And again, many of the points that we address come again and again, and I think this is the merit of having this kind of discussion where people stay and continue the process. Let me get back to one point that has been raised, and I think it links up to this issue of trust. And this is where we realize that we need to work from a different paradigm. The trust of on the corporation, that issue and the need to move from the trust toward the corporation to the trust toward the people, I think it comes from a very simple fact. It is that we have gone from industrial capitalism to global financial capitalism. In industrial capitalism, the fate of a corporation was linked to the fate of its employees and the fate of the country in which it was located. When in the 50s, the president of GM said, what is good for GM is good for America, he was mainly right. He was absolutely right. What was good for GM was good for America because as GM made more profit, it hired more people, it could pay its employees better, and so on and so forth. The global financial capitalism has delinked the fate of a corporation from the fate of its employees. And for instance, you have companies which announce laying off people, and in the afternoon their share price goes up 2 or 3 percentage points. So this is why we are facing this issue and the need to restore trust, because the repository of trust, which was the corporation, which was an institution, doesn't exist. So this is one of the bases of our discussion here. Now let me again take some points that we have come up in our discussion. First of all, I think we all realize this trust deficit that Alexander has highlighted very starkly with respect to the index. But in addition to that, what is striking is that the reason for this trust deficit is not anymore relating to hard factor, growth, profitability. It is more and more linked to soft factor. We get back to this notion of the individual, to this notion that sheer economic figures are not sufficient anymore. And in a way, we are talking about this gap between what the public is expecting and what the company or the institution, let us speak about institutions, is delivering. And then we get to another, I think, very important observation that we had, and of course it can be discussed, but I think it is a point that we need to take into strong consideration, is the fact that, as you have said, self-regulation has not worked, and win-win has a lot of flaws, or at least, to put it mildly, a lot of loopholes. So to avoid being too controversial. And so I think we get to this point, again, which is at the core of our discussion, that the only solution, as somebody said, is to transform hearts and minds. And it is how my values are being related to the kind of decisions I am making, and how can I assess, in a way, the impact of these decisions on the lives, the betterment or the hardship that this inflict on the people impacted by my decision. And so it gets to this notion, and this is easier to apply, as we said, in small and medium-sized companies than in publicly listed companies. It comes to this notion of redefining the raison d'être of a company in a broader sense. And in that respect, of course, there are some exceptions. We heard about Unilever CEO saying that he didn't even know when he was talking what was the share price of Unilever, because he could not care less about what was the share price as he was talking. And you get to this notion that, in fact, so much relies on the leadership and the mindset of a CEO and the ability of a leader to align the management to, in a way, the broader meaning and the broader raison d'être and the longer-term view of a company. Then we get to the notion of how do you assess performance in that respect. And I think talking about very specific issues related to corruption, we heard from Fredrik this very interesting new concept, new measurement tool, if you want, of a fixed rate. And we have also understood, and Fredrik was very realistic about it, that in fact you get about 60% success, but you get also 40% failures when you are trying to address that. And the only way that this failure rate can be reduced is to continue to apply the pressure, but the pressure is not necessarily naming and shaming, because, as you say, in many cases, the confrontational approach doesn't work. So, in a way, what we also understood from you, Fredrik, is the fact that the compliance paradigm, in the strict sense of the term, as many corporations apply it today, is not anymore sufficient. And we get back to this notion of a broader paradigm in which we need to put the activities, the behavior, the philosophy, the ethics, to get back to this crucial word, the ethics of a corporation, but only the ethics of other institutions like NGOs, like government, like religious institutions, and so on and so forth. So I would like to stop here to thank our speakers. Before thanking our speakers, we have a break, 25 minutes, And then we are moving to 2 topics, and again we will see some elements coming back. We have a topic about how business and NGO can be partner in addressing the health challenge, and it is taking place in this room. And then the future of impact investing, which is taking place next door. The reverse. The reverse. So, civil society and business on health, it is here. No. Yes, this is what I said, plenary here. Ah, okay. And the next door is impact investing. So, yes. Yes, exactly. It's next door. Yes. So, thank you. Thanks to our speakers.